Well, the Kinder Morgan project, I'm sure you're all familiar with it, twinning a current pipeline to expand by 3 to 5-fold the number of bitumen crude laden vessels leaving Burnaby, and they would have to, of course, transit near the Saanich-Gulf Islands and out past Victoria. I'm certainly against the project, and I think a lot of people are, because it's, you know, if you're going to go to 300 vessels a year, you're going to see a lot more risk. Just as a matter of the odds, the risks of a tanker spill and accident become very high. The project is now, they're going through, have they held what they call a consultation yet on Mayne?
No, they're only doing one on Salt Spring, and it was done last week.
Yeah. Now they've promised to go back to Salt Spring because there have been protests, as far as I know, within Saanich-Gulf Islands. Every Kinder Morgan Public Information Center session met with protests. On Salt Spring, they somehow managed to persuade them that they needed to come back and do a proper session at which they sat at the front of the room and took questions from people. The Kinder Morgan, it's been a message control strategy of corporations for the last probably 15, 20 years, not to hold a public meeting like this where they're at the front of the room and take questions, but to hold what they call a public information session, where people wander in and look at easels or displays, or so that people, and then they have their spokespeople there to answer questions, but they're one-on-one, so the whole community doesn't hear a particularly good question and doesn't hear the proponent's attempt to answer it. So it's a deliberate strategy to diffuse public protest and to work against public information. Now they've promised apparently to go back to Salt Spring and sit at the front of the room with an audience full of people and take questions. So for anyone who wanted to go to that, keep an eye out for whenever that gets publicized. The date isn't chosen, and it's not even clear who would sponsor it yet. What they told us, and I went to the one in Central Saanich, because I happened to be, it was on a weekend when I was able to get back from Ottawa. What they're basically putting forward is that they are at the very beginning of their process. They won't have an application to the National Energy Board for any specific hearings for at least a year. This is their public consultation phase, and then there'll be many more phases. The bottom line, though, I think, is to keep lining up the arguments about why it makes no sense, and not just environmentally, but from the point of view of Canada as an economy. Why would we be exporting raw bitumen any more than we'd be exporting raw logs? It's not a proposition that makes sense to a lot of people. And they will be, if they do this, putting a lot of vessels through some very tricky navigational straits, under the bridges in Vancouver and out through the strait. It's very tricky navigation. They claim they won't be using super tankers. The biggest vessel they can use is the one they currently have, which is, I think, is it called Apotex, that size of a tanker? It's a specific tanker size that they're now using. The difference is, they didn't say in their sessions, is that if you load those more heavily, they sit more deeply in the water, and they are now building a different dock in Burnaby to accommodate loading the tankers more heavily. And they will need to have more dredging, because of course, the more you load any vessel, the lower it's going to sit in the water, the more you need to make sure the channels are deeper. So the chances of an accident, I think, are unacceptably high. And then there's the economic argument, why would we want to ship our bitumen crude out of the country before refining it? And paradoxically, increasing the flow of bitumen crude to Burnaby is actually undermining the viability of the Burnaby refinery. There used to be 4 refineries in Burnaby. The last one there is the Chevron refinery. And because it has to compete now by price for the bitumen that comes to Burnaby, it used to just come there for the refineries. Now it's going there for export. And Chevron can't compete with the price that the offshore buyers are offering. So the Burnaby refinery has already reduced production by 1/3 and laid off 1/3 of its workforce. So if the Burnaby refinery were to close absolutely, we'd have no more refineries in the lower mainland, which might not strike people as horrific, except when you consider that you'd have Canadian bitumen going from Alberta to goodness knows California or China, and coming back and we'd buy it refined at a higher price because we couldn't afford to refine it in Canada and we lost all the jobs in Burnaby. So there's a lot of reasons to be upset about this proposal, and I'm certainly against it. I think it will be a BC election issue provincially. I think it's important to raise pipelines, tankers throughout the BC election. I mean, that's, I think, pretty obvious to people. We want to know where the various parties stand on fracking, pipelines, tankers, and in the all-candidate meetings, and in the national and in the provincial press through the election, make these key issues.